So to get started, let's talk about these substrates and what makes them so darn special. Now, before we get to the Tesserae, we first need to talk about the adhesive and the grouting. I know this seems a little backwards, but just stick with me here. Ooh, I like that. We're layering in the interest. Yes, we are. So what we have to think about is part of the appeal of mosaic art is that people want to touch it. Who can blame them? Mosaic is very tactile. So once you decide on whether to grout or not, this takes us to the adhesive. If you don't grout, then you'll probably want to do one of two things. So I guess you could consider mixed media mosaics the kitchen sink of mosaics, but let's get to it. Welcome back. And if you're new here, my name is Julie. And on this channel, we talk about tips, tricks, tools, adhesives, materials, and specific mosaic projects, all to shorten your learning curve when it comes to creating mosaic art. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please consider subscribing. At the time of filming this video, we're inching closer to Galentine's Day, which is February 13th, and Valentine's Day, which is February 14th, whichever one you celebrate, or both. And the idea for today's video came from comments from a previous video where one viewer asked if I would show how I created my mixed media mosaic heart paperweights. So I'll show you how I made that mixed media heart paperweight, as well as a Pique Assiette paperweight and a stained glass heart paperweight. And I'll also show you in this video how I made the substrate. Now, in my opinion, the substrate that we're going to make today is as good or possibly even better than the one that I used in my heart paperweight. There is a pride factor to it and so much more, and we'll talk more about that a little later in the video. I've been making mixed media mosaics and Pique Assiette and glass mosaics for over 25 years now. And so I've brought that here on YouTube. So on my channel, you can find all sorts of resources and tutorials regarding all three types of those mosaic styles. I'll include links to those playlists down below in the description. Now you can access this information if you're watching on your desktop computer by clicking Show More under the video description. And if you're watching on your tablet or your smartphone, you can click the down arrow to the right of the video title. So in today's video, I'll show you how I created 3 different heart paperweights from substrate creation to tiling, grouting, and finishing off. It's everything you need to know so you can make some mosaic hearts of your own. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. So to get started, let's talk about these substrates and what makes them so darn special. And then once we start tiling, we'll circle back around and we'll talk about the substrates that I used on my original mosaic paperweights. So to start, I used silicone molds from the baking aisle to create homemade substrates. There are so many options available. Holy moly. Now, these are pretty straightforward with no embellishments or indentations to the molds. The sides are straight up and down, and they're also pretty deep, which I like, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Now, these molds here allow me to make 6 heart substrates at a time, or however long it takes me to fill them, and I'll explain that as well. You may have seen other videos here on my channel where I create my own substrates, and I think making your own substrates is a good way to use up any extra grout or thin set that you've already mixed up for a previous project but didn't use it all. It's also a great way to use up any thin set or grout that you feel is coming to the end of its shelf life. And yeah, unfortunately, this stuff does have a shelf life. So thin set is a cement-based adhesive here in the US. If you live outside of the US, look for an alternative in your area. So over time, as I grout various projects or mix up thin set as my adhesive, I sometimes have leftovers. So instead of throwing it away, I simply add it to silicone molds. Whatever holiday is coming up that I'd like a substrate for, I'll just pull out a silicone mold and start pouring in my leftovers. So not only can you make your own substrates with silicone molds, but you can also control how thick or thin your substrate will be. And it doesn't matter if you fill them up with gray thinset or white grout or whatever, because you're going to cover them anyways with your mosaic work. It doesn't matter what they look like at this stage. So once I've filled up my silicone mold, or I've poured as many substrates as I want, I let the last one that I've filled fully cure for at least 48 hours, and then like magic, they peel right out. Another great thing about these homemade substrates is that they would work well outdoors, but I wouldn't leave them out there if you live in a freeze-thaw area. I also wouldn't put them in or on the ground. They don't take the place of a stepping stone, let's say. You'd want to use cement for something like that. So the substrates I've used for my heart paperweights in the past are wood. So I've either purchased manufactured wood hearts, or I've cut my own using a jigsaw. And then I prep them like usual before I get started with tiling, and then off I go. But using silicone molds to create your own grout or thinset substrates is also a great alternative if you don't want to deal with cutting your own wood substrate, and then of course prepping the substrate for mosaic. And this is especially helpful if you live in, let's say, an apartment or a condo where cutting wood really isn't an option. Also, making your own substrates just feels good. It goes along with the fact that you're adding another layer of handmadeness to your mosaic. Is that a word? I don't think that's a word, but you get the idea. It just feels good to also make your mosaic substrate. Now, if you've got any rough edges like what I've got here, you can easily get rid of them using a metal file. They very easily smooth out, so make sure you wear a dust mask while you're doing this, just as you would when you're grouting. I've listed some heart silicone molds for you down in the description, as well as some Tesserae ideas. So if you're on the market or you're wanting to get this going, there's a good place to start. Now, before we get to the Tesserae, we first need to talk about the adhesive and the grouting. I know this seems a little backwards, but just stick with me here. When you're thinking about these mosaic hearts, you want to reverse engineer how they're going to turn out, starting with, are you going to grout or not? And here's why. Grout can sometimes control sharp points and jagged edges. If your heart mosaic will truly be used as a paperweight or something that's handled a lot, you might want to consider grouting just to eliminate the possibility of somebody getting cut when they pick it up. And yes, I have done a video here on my channel all about how to smooth out sharp points and jagged edges, and I will include a link to that. But as an artist, it is your responsibility in a way to make sure that people don't get hurt when they touch your artwork. If your heart will be coffee table decor or put on a shelf to be admired from afar, then it's probably not going to get handled a lot, if at all, so maybe you can forego the grouting. But keep in mind your mosaic heart is going to be gorgeous, and folks are going to want to touch it and see it up close. Also keep in mind that using grout to smooth any rough edges or sharp points is challenging and can be frustrating. You can't rely on it to hide these things. So in a way, we do think of grout as something that's more aesthetic. It adds to the overall look of your mosaic. Yes, it also does secure the pieces on your mosaic, but it's not an adhesive. And like I said, it is hard to get the grout to conceal any sort of sharp points and jagged edges. It's just sort of hit or miss. So what we have to think about is part of the appeal of mosaic art is that people want to touch it. Who can blame them? Mosaic is very tactile. So once you decide on whether to grout or not, this takes us to the adhesive. If you don't grout, then you'll probably want to do one of two things. You'll want to place your Tesserae on the substrate so that they're touching or as close as possible to each other. Or you'll want to paint your substrate the same color as your Tesserae so that when you look straight on at your heart, any parts of the substrate that are showing will blend in with the Tesserae color, or colors. Also, when making a mixed media mosaic, if you want all of your tesserae to be at the same height on the surface, you'll want to use an adhesive that sets up, meaning you can float or build up your thinner tesserae, and you would use a less amount of adhesive on your thicker tesserae. So in the end, your thinner tesserae and your thicker tesserae would look like they're at the same thickness on your substrate. So in order to float or build up tesserae, what sort of adhesives am I talking about? So I'm talking about thin set, epoxy sculpt, and sometimes even tile adhesive, which is also called mastic. I'm not talking about a white PVA glue or a silicone. Although those are great adhesives for mosaic, they won't work if you're using tesserae of different thicknesses and you're trying to build up and level off your tesserae on the surface area. Personally, with a project like this, ideally, I'd like all of my tesserae to be at the same height or level on the surface, but you certainly don't have to, especially if you use tesserae that might be 2D or 3D. I'll be using pre-mixed thin set for all three of these hearts, and I chose thin set for the reasons I just mentioned. And I specifically chose the pre-mixed kind because I knew my timeline and availability might be scattered and scarce during this project. So the pre-mixed variety, given my available time, allowed me to quickly and very easily get right to work. So it comes down to personal preference, but make sure you put some thought into your adhesive given the tesserae you'd like to use. I know that all of this can seem like a lot to think about as you're getting started with planning your heart mosaics or really any mosaic, and that's why I created something called the Mosaic Clarity Checklist. This is a quick 27 questions that you can answer that's going to guide you to get to the answers for your mosaic. Now, it may sound intimidating, 27 questions. Believe it or not, these are going to come to you like boom, 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 the more mosaics you do. They're easy questions, yes or no, but by the end, you will have a clear path, a roadmap for your mosaic. You will be able to start purchasing tesserae, tools, whatever it is you need. You'll be able to plan, make a budget, and then of course come up with a timeline. So I will include a link to the Mosaic Clarity Checklist down below in the description in case you're interested in finding out more. Okay, we're finally ready to get to the good stuff. The tesserae. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to make 3 heart paperweights in today's video, a mixed media mosaic, a Pique Assiette mosaic, and a stained glass mosaic. And I wanted to share the possibilities with a substrate like this in case you like to just work with ceramic or porcelain or glass or mixed media. And yes, of course, I will include as many links as I can down below. I know you guys want to know what tools I'm using and the materials and all of that, so I will include that down below in the description. Let's get tiling. So the first heart I'll start with is the red mixed media heart. Okay, so folks always want to know what is the surface that's on my work table. So what I do is I put wax paper over my work table surface when I'm working on a project like this. And I like to use wax paper because most mosaic adhesives don't stick to it, except for resin. As we all know, resin has a way of sticking to anything and everything. So with this being a mixed media mosaic, the sky's the limit as far as what you can use. And like we just discussed a few minutes ago, you don't even have to grout your heart if you don't want to. So what I like to do when it comes to a small substrate like this is I like to go through my tesserae stash to see what I have available. And I'll start with my scraps first. This will add a lot of additional interest to my mosaic by using different types of tesserae. I like to think of it as we're layering in the interest. So I've pulled together a mix of red tesserae, including glass, ceramic, and porcelain. I'm loving all the shades of red that are represented here on my project tray. Now, as I've previously mentioned, the adhesive I'll be using for all three hearts is pre-mixed thin set. So I'll start by tiling the sides of the heart first. By tiling the sides first, this will not only give me a slightly bigger tiling area on the front of the heart, but it will also put the grout line for the side tesserae on the side, as opposed to on the front of the mosaic. So for the sides, you can use your tesserae whole if your substrate is thick enough, or you can break down the tesserae. Now, if you break your tesserae down into little pieces and you're going piece by piece by piece, it's going to take you longer to tile, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. So I move the tesserae around along the sides of the substrate until everything fit nicely. You'll notice that I'm keeping my substrate raised up on broken tile, and that's simply to make it easier for me to pick up and put down the substrate without, hopefully touching the tesserae I just adhered along the sides. And then I got to work tiling the front of the heart. Since I have so many different types of tesserae and shades of red, it's pretty easy for me not to put two of the same shade next to each other. But that's just a rule that I have for myself. I'm trying to place my tesserae an equal distance apart from each other to create a consistent grout line, but please don't stress yourself out about it. Mine isn't perfect either. The mosaic style of this heart is called mixed media, which we've talked about, because you're literally combining a mix of all different types of media in the same mosaic piece. So tesserae such as glass, ceramic, porcelain, china, beads, broken tile, plates, bowls, and cups, and even found objects are combined into the same mosaic. But mixed media mosaic are also a really fun way to use up your smaller tesserae, including your cutoffs. And if you've been around here for a while, you know I always encourage you to save your cutoffs because you never know when you'll need them. So I guess you could consider mixed media mosaics the kitchen sink of mosaics, but oh, they're so much more fun than that. Okay, so if you'd rather not pick up and put down your substrate as you're tiling, you could place it on a Lazy Susan, which would allow you to just turn the substrate around while you're tiling. And just as I do on my work table, you'll also want to put down a piece of wax paper on the surface of your Lazy Susan before you begin tiling. And I'll include links down below in the description for the Lazy Susan and wax paper that I prefer to use here in the studio. So once I'm done tiling, I'll put it to the side for at least 24 to 48 hours before I handle it. So the next heart I'm going to make is, some would call it a broken plate mosaic. It's really officially called Pique Assiette mosaic. And this is when you take broken plates, bowls, and mugs, crockery, found objects, broken tile, and you combine it and put it all together in the same mosaic. Now, what I'm going to be using today is broken plates and a broken teacup. So I don't have all of those items that would contribute to making it a Pique Assiette mosaic. It's still in the same vein, and when you think about broken plate mosaics, you think Pique Assiette. So I'm calling it Pique Assiette, and here we go. So just like with the previous mixed media heart, I like to start by tiling the sides first before I tile the front. If you're wanting a more clean or simple side to your heart, you could opt to use Tesserae, which are the same exact size or next to the same size. And this would give you a consistent grout line. So in the case of the Tesserae I'm using here, I would need to cut and nip my Tesserae to the same size. If I was using something like vitreous glass or maybe some squares of stained glass, then those would be easier and quicker to use because the vitreous comes in only a few sizes, and the stained glass can be quickly cut to any size I want. Using certain sizes of Tesserae that will reduce the number of grout lines can also help your mosaic heart sit on its side more securely when on display, if that's how you want to use it. But also, by reducing the number of grout lines, it will hopefully not scratch up the surface of the furniture it's being displayed on. So another plus or pro when creating your own substrates, as in the case of today's video, is that I can control how thick the substrates are. For example, if I wanted to use whole vitreous tile in the 3/4 inch size, then I would need to reverse engineer the final mosaic by first pouring a substrate thick enough to accommodate a 3/4 inch size vitreous tile, which would be running along the side of the substrate. Pouring your own substrates when possible opens up a whole new world of possibilities. So once I'm done tiling the edge and moving things around to make sure everything fits nicely, it's time to get started with tiling the front. For this heart, I'm using this flower design as my focal point. Now this was once a teacup, a china teacup, and I'll cut it down a little bit so it'll lay somewhat flat on the substrate. I first want to place it on the substrate to eye how it'll look and how much space it'll take up. So doing this will also give me an idea of what tesserae I need for the border. If you're going to use letters or words in your design or some other special tesserae or focal point, then you'll want to do the same thing first, which is playing around with the placement before you begin adhering it to the substrate. For the border of the heart, I like this mint green thin plate. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bullnose shape edge, but it's thin enough and provides a nice finished edge to the front of the heart. And I'll cut pieces of it to go all the way around the surface area of the heart. I should also mention that if you see me using tools in this video that you'd like to learn how to use, I've got lots of videos here on my channel that will teach you how, and I'll include a link to the tools playlist down below in the description so you can check it out. And I'll keep going with the tiling. For the background, I'm filling it in with smaller pieces of the mint green plate that I used for the border. It's just a small area all around the flower focal point. This heart clearly demonstrates why I went with thin set as the adhesive. Now, I have a few different thicknesses of tesserae going on here. The mint green plate is thicker than the flower teacup, but I want to give the illusion that everything is the same thickness and at the same level on the surface. So the thin set allows me to build up the thinner tesserae. Just remember, if you're making a mosaic like this, where you're working with different thicknesses of tesserae, you want to check your surface levels every so often. And if you need to push down any tesserae which are a little too high, and pull up any tesserae which have dipped down a little too low, go ahead and do it. And in some cases, you may need to add a little more adhesive behind those thinner tesserae, which are lower, or you may realize you put too much adhesive behind some of those thicker tesserae and you need to remove some adhesive. And so when I'm done tiling, I'll put it to the side and allow it to dry for at least 24 to 48 hours before I handle it. I'll include a list down below in the description for everything that I used in today's video in case you'd like to get started with some mosaic hearts of your own. So the last heart I'm going to tile today is a rainbow heart. I just love rainbows. I'll start by pulling a mix of stained glass shards in rainbow colors, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet, as well as some black stained glass. I've got a design in mind, so I'm going to get started by scoring and cutting my stained glass down into thin pieces. They're about as thin as a common matchstick. I'm using the turquoise tesserae as my guide for each of the others that I score and cut. They aren't perfect. They're just about the same length and width, but again, not identical. I'll also score and cut the black stained glass, which I'm going to use along the edge or the side of the substrate. Now these pieces are bigger than the rainbow colors I just cut. So to get started like I've done with the previous two hearts, I'll adhere the black stained glass to the sides of the substrate. Okay, so earlier I mentioned that you could put your substrate on a Lazy Susan and just turn it around as you're tiling the edge. Now, there are advantages to doing that. The obvious being you could greatly reduce the possibility that you could touch or bump a tesserae. The other advantage is gravity. Gravity is going to do its thing by trying to pull down your tesserae, especially if you've used larger pieces. And it's okay to use larger pieces. But by resting your substrate on a Lazy Susan and just turning it as you're tiling the tesserae, if it does drop down, it's able then to rest on the wax paper and cure in that position. So once I'm done with the sides, I'll get started on the front of this heart. This time, I'm going to start tiling a border first. And I'll start at the top of the heart with red stained glass. I'll adhere just a few tesserae before I move on to including a few orange tesserae on both sides of the heart. Now I'm just getting into a tiling groove and picking whichever tesserae I want. I'm trying not to overthink it too much. And yes, as you probably guessed, now I'm going to move on to the yellow next. I'm trying not to put two of the same exact tesserae next to each other. That's just my personal rule. Next up is the green tesserae. I should mention here that within each color group I have at least 2 shades represented and sometimes 3. And then I'll move on to the blue tesserae. Now as you can see, it's only taking about 2 or 3 tesserae of each color on either side of the heart before I move on to the next color, so it's not much. That's why this is such a good project for your scrap glass. And then I'll finish off the bottom of the heart with the violet or purple tesserae. Now as you can see, like I mentioned, they aren't perfectly cut. Some are thinner than others and some are longer or shorter than others. I like that look and I'm not looking for perfection. Next I'll move on to the area inside the border. And for this area I want to cut out some black circles from stained glass. I want the circles to be different sizes. To cut circles, it's easiest if you start with a square. So you're going to take your square and you're going to nip off the corners with your wheeled glass nippers. And then you'll continue to round out the areas which are between the areas where the corners used to be. Does that make sense? You just want to keep going around the tesserae, making very small nips. And once it generally looks like a circle, you want to move on to the next one. So once I was done cutting out all the circles, I took them over to my glass grinder to smooth out the edges. Now you can do this in a few different ways. You can use a grinding stone, you can use a Dremel, or you can do my favorite thing, which is use an electric glass grinder. And here's what they look like when I'm done. So I'll get started with placing the larger circles first. These will be my focal points. And then I'll adhere the smaller circles around them, trying to keep the grout lines consistent. So let's go back a minute and talk about using focal points in your mosaics. In particular, let's use the example of my heart paperweights, which I shared with you a little earlier. They included wood letter tiles like what you'd find in a Scrabble game. So in your mosaic, you can certainly use you know, letter beads or the Scrabble pieces or even ceramic letter tiles, whatever you want. My advice though is that if you're going to grout your hearts, I would recommend staying away from wood pieces. So in the previous heart, I used the rose teacup as my focal point. And in this heart, I'm using stained glass circles. Those are both fine. No problem. They work well when grouted. If you use something like wood in your mosaic art, whether it's the focal point or not, honestly, you'll need to tape them up really well to keep the grout off. And it can get frustrating if the grout bleeds onto the wood, even if you seal it really well. So my advice, if you want to use some focal points like letter, words, or whatever, is to go with ceramic or glass. That's the safest bet. Plastic letter beads are okay, but you'll want to tape those off as well to keep the grout from scratching things up or getting grout into the little crevices. But at least the grout won't bleed on them because they aren't porous. Now getting back to this heart mosaic, as you can see, I've been moving things around and making adjustments. And now I like how everything's looking, so I'll put it to the side for at least 24 to 48 hours before I handle it. I'll include a list down below in the description for everything that I used in today's video in case you'd like to get started with some heart mosaic paperweights. These hearts have been sitting here for at least 48 hours and they're ready to be grouted. Now I'm going to use two different grout colors today. So the red heart will be a dark gray grout and the flower heart and rainbow heart will both get white grout. I don't have to prep the substrates for grouting, so I'll get started with mixing up the white grout first. So I've mixed up my grout and I'm waiting a few minutes just to allow the chemical reaction to take place. Now, if you aren't sure how to mix up the grout, or you'd like to color your grout, tint your grout, even cement-based adhesive for that matter, or maybe you'd like to add some glitter to it, I'll include a link to the playlist down below in the description. My grout has been sitting here for a few minutes and it's ready to go. So I'll spoon on a small amount and with my flat fingers, I'll rub it clockwise, counterclockwise into the grout line. I'm pushing the grout into the grout line, filling in the open areas between the tesserae. And I'll continue this clockwise, counterclockwise motion all over the substrate. I'll also go along the back where the tiled edge meets the substrate. And I'll make sure to run my fingers along that area to create a clean grout edge. And once I've smoothed on the grout all over the substrate, I'll put it to the side and move on to the next heart. I'll grout this one in the same exact way by using flat fingers to push the grout into the grout line. I'm not doing this in a rigorous way because even though I use thin set as an adhesive, which is a super strong adhesive, there's always a risk you could pop off a tesserae. So I'm just taking my time to fill in the grout line, and of course I want to make sure I grout the sides of the heart and the area on the back of the heart where the sides meet the substrate. And then once I'm done grouting both hearts with the white grout, I'll let them sit for about 5 to 10 minutes to dry a little bit. Okay, they've been sitting here drying and now it's time to clean off the excess grout. So I'll do this in the same way as I did putting on the grout by going in a clockwise, counterclockwise motion. I'll also try not to remove or dig out any grout from the grout lines. Now, of course, some grout in those areas is being removed. How could it not be? But I'm trying my best not to purposely get in there and remove more. My main concern is to remove the excess grout which is on the surface area of the tesserae. And then I'll look them over one last time to make sure all of the edges of the tesserae are exposed and that there's no residual grout that could cause grout haze. These look good and I'll move on and do the same exact process to the mixed media red heart, but this time I'll use dark gray grout. If the back of your heart substrate is rough, which can sometimes happen with a homemade substrate like this, You can easily smooth it out with a metal file, just as I showed you earlier in this video after I had just pulled out the substrates from the silicone mold. And once everything looks pretty clean, I like to use an old chip brush or paintbrush to remove any grout dust. And here they are. All 3 hearts have been grouted, and I'll give them one last look over to make sure all of the edges of the tesserae are revealed so that I can move on to the final step. Okay, now that the hearts have been tiled and grouted, it's time for us to move on to the final step, which is finishing them off. The first thing to do is, of course, you need to sign your artwork. Always, always, always. And for something like this, I like to sign it along the edge, and I'll show you why in a minute. But for the marker, I always like to use this one right here when signing my pieces. And then once your signature is dry, cut out a heart shape from felt in a coordinating color, either to the tesserae or the substrate or whatever color you like, and then glue it on to the back of your substrate. So for the adhesive, I prefer to use Weld Bond. It's a thin adhesive, it doesn't clump, and it dries clear. Should any of it ooze out of the sides, of course you can easily wipe it off. So putting a cute little heart-shaped piece of felt on the back of your mosaic will eliminate it from scratching the surface of your furniture or shelf should you plan to display it laying down. I'll include a list down below in the description for everything that I used in today's video in case you'd like to get started with some heart paperweights of your own. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. No. Let it go, let it go. Okay. You got this, girl. You got this, okay? You and me, we got this. Can't say it. I just can't say it. Nope. Oh, come on, Julie. Concentrate. Concentrate. Nope, that just didn't flow. No, girl, that just did not come out very smooth. Ooh, I like that. We're layering in the interest. Yes, we are. Wow, this is a long video. Oh my gosh, I had a try. I had one of those. I need to bring it down. Bring down that energy level now. For more mosaic inspiration, check out one of these 2 videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.